Some. Good morning to some, good afternoon, and good evening to others. It is 53 years since economist Milton Friedman's seminal explanation that a corporate executive is an employee of the shareholders of a business, and that his, or today, hers, responsibility is to conduct business in accordance with shareholder desires. In 2019, the Business Roundtable, an association of more than 200 CEOs of leading American corporations, committed to leading their companies for the benefit of all stakeholders. This includes customers, employees, suppliers, communities, and then let's not forget shareholders too. So this is arguably a fundamental change in perspective in corporate leadership. Today, in this webinar, we explore what makes for a good corporate ESG leader. Are there any? And if so, what are their traits and what obstacles do they have to face as they navigate their way through what is undoubtedly an ever-changing landscape? To give us their insights and share their experience today, we have three very distinguished guests. Wendy Poulton is the Director of Strategic Mindsets in South Africa, a business development consultancy focused on risk and strategy. Her expertise is deep in the sustainability and climate change fields in developing countries, having been the general manager for organizational strategy at National Electricity Utility Eskom. Wendy is a Secretary General of the South African National Energy Association and the Secretariat of the Energy and Green Economy Working Group of the South African BRICS Business Council. She holds a Master of Science degree from the University of Pretoria. From Devon in the United Kingdom, we have Mark Drewell. For 10 years, Mark was on the executive of South African multinational company Barlow World, where he was responsible for integrating sustainability into the business strategy of the company and its subsidiaries. Following that, Mark was chief executive of the Globally Responsible Leadership Initiative, a coalition of businesses and business schools working on the edge of sustainability and leadership development to create a new generation of globally responsible business leaders. Mark studied a PPE at Oxford University and is now managing director of New Foundation Farms, a disruptive startup to produce at scale affordable nutrient-dense food on regenerative soils, processed and sold locally. Over the past 10 years, Jane Diplock, AO, has focused her energies on governance and standard setting at global and national organizations within the areas of capital markets, sustainability, biodiversity, and digitization. She has long experience in Asia and the Middle East, and Jane is currently an ambassador of the World Benchmarking Alliance, director of the Australian Financial Services Group, and is a member of the governing body of the ESG Exchange, just to name a few. She is also a retired director of the Value Reporting Foundation. Jane has studied humanities, law, and international relations at the universities of Sydney, the Australian National University, and the London School of Economics. So I think you can see why we feel that this is a distinguished panel that we have today. As in other webinars, we will start off with discussion among the panelists, but then certainly open up to questions coming from participants from all around the world, and we look forward to that, and we'll try and capture as many of them as we possibly can. But Wendy, let's kick off with you. Your company helps organizations stay relevant and competitive in a fast-changing business landscape. How has ESG and sustainability over the past decades changed, and what do executives really need to do to stay abreast of these developments?
Thanks, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I think I've been involved with sustainability for a number of years, and I think it's always been around, but it's really the pace of change that we've seen start to accelerate over the last decade or so, and the morphing towards more issues on ESG rather than broader sustainability. But I think from a leadership perspective, what it has meant is that It's broadened the issues out. It's become a whole set of global issues which leaders need to manage, not just about their own company, but things like climate change, which have a global perspective. I think it's also meant that ESG leaders are not just the CEO anymore. It's everybody in the organization because of, again, of the breadth of issues. And that the trick is really to try and contextualize some of those global issues for what it means for you in your particular role, and to become influencers, to try and convince people from a strategy and risk perspective as well, to maybe do things long before they would have normally. And it's a lot for me about a risk appetite that a leader has, about being able to think beyond your tenure as a CEO or whatever position that you are in, be able to have this more integrated view, be able to contextualize it, and be able to accept that you can't be the see-all, know-all person anymore, that you work in this ecosystem of people within your organization and outside to make things happen, because this co-creation and transformative ESG is really only going to happen when we have leaders that work together in areas, obviously, that make sense and not in competitive areas. And that requires a really different way of thinking of leaders. And I think that's what we're really starting to see. And I'd be really keen to hear Jane's reflections on some of the leaders and what the characteristics are that she thought that they have. But for me, it's somebody that really is an influencer, is very aware of themselves, their own way of thinking, how they lead others within the organization and externally, thinks longer term, thinks broader than the company, and does it because it makes good sense for the company, because it is going to give it a competitive edge. It is going to help it identify new opportunities and not just think about ESG as this add-on. And that's really what the shift I've seen in the last 5 years or so is this shift of ESG embedded in strategy, rather than let's think about it once we've done the strategy and see if we need to tick some more boxes. So thanks, Alex, back to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Wendy. And perhaps one of the areas we can pick up later is, within the typical executive committee makeup, who is responsible? Is it just the CEO? Is it now the modern day chief sustainability officer, or actually is it across the entire executive leadership? And I think, Mark, those are probably issues you've dealt with in the past. So I'd like to bring you in here. Your work at the Global Leadership Institute, you talked about developing globally responsible business leaders. Please help us understand what is a globally responsible business leader.
Thanks, Alex. It's a great question. It's a beautiful sunny day here in the southwest of England, and when I look out over the green and pleasant land that I'm sitting in at the moment, it's hard to imagine there's anything fundamentally wrong with the world, at least when you see it locally. But that is the heart of the question of what it means to be globally responsible. And what it means is that the starting point is an acknowledgement that the world that we built doesn't make a great deal of sense for so many people. And it certainly doesn't make any sense for future generations in terms of the way the probability of our species surviving, given the damage we're doing to the natural world on which we depend. So the starting point, I think, for being a globally responsible leader is recognizing that the system we built is fundamentally broken. And that in turn leads to the second part of what it means to be globally responsible. And that is to ask a question. And the question is, what kind of world do we want to create together with the extraordinary resources and capacities we have and we master? What kind of world do we want to create together? Because interrogating that is the first step in thinking about what it means to be globally responsible. And the best way of understanding that is that the role has shifted from one where the job is to lead your organization within a set of predefined rules that society has decided make perfect sense and work well, and all you have to do is obey the law and try not to screw up too badly, into a world where we are all co-creators of trying to understand what it is that we should be doing differently in the future. So we think about that as this notion of statesmanship for the common good rather than leadership of the organization. And the common good requires as an idea, requires an ongoing process of investigating what on earth that means. And then looking inside yourself as an individual and your organization and asking, how do we stack up against this assessment that we're making about what's wrong with the world, where are we trying to take it, and where's the gap, and what should I be doing, what should my organization be doing to fix it. And the last point I'll make in this for now anyway is that one of the reasons that my personal journey over the last 30 years has been one of moving from being in large institutions and trying to shape global agendas to doing something from the bottom up is I've reached a very profound conclusion that what we do with the existing institutions is broadly we try and sensitize them enough to get out of the way of the emerging new. And so that's one half of the equation. The other half is the creation of disruptors from people who are completely unreasonable and determined to shape a world that's different to the one we've got and just get on and do it. So there's these two things that sit. So it's statesmanship for the common good. It's asking the question of what kind of world do we want to create and recognizing that the one we've got isn't terribly helpful for us in the long run. And it is thinking about that at a personal and an organizational level as a continuous process.
Thank you. Wow. So some great personal insight there, some similarity and parallel with what Wendy was saying around fast pace of change. That's dramatically been happening. Jane, let's come to you. Please give us some of the great ESG leaders that you know or that you have worked with. You talk about King Charles of England at the moment. That was an interesting one, I thought. Mark Carney, of course, Boon Chai Lo of the Singapore Stock Exchange. Why these individuals? What makes them special, and how do they stand out?
Well, I think that those people that I've mentioned are actually, perhaps I'd add Paul Druckmann, chair of the World Benchmarking Alliance, and Paul Dickinson, the founder of CDP. And I mean, there are actually hundreds of people that I really admire in this space. So it's awkward to have to actually even name some. But I guess what I see in all of these people is an ability and a willingness to look over the horizon, to look beyond the business of today to the business of tomorrow, and to shape their organizations and their thinking around that. Now, that partly reflects, I think, what Wendy and Mark have talked about, which is actually the world we want to live in. But all of the people that I've had the pleasure to work for and have admired enormously have also a very practical side to them. And Mervyn King, for example, Professor Mervyn King is another one. These have been great thought leaders, but they're not just philosophers. They are much more than philosophers. They're actually practical people who have really worked on solutions to try and help everybody to gather the inspiration that they have for what we should be looking at over the horizon. So if you think of Mark Carney, and I respect him enormously, his first, as chair of the Financial Stability Board, setting up the task force on carbon financial disclosures, TCFD, actually was transformational in the way in which a lot of corporates realized that the linkage to financial stability is economic stability. We all need economic stability for the world's economies to flourish. Therefore, the link is we must be taking into account climate change and the risks and the opportunities that offers. And similarly, he's done similar work with the TNFD. So the whole idea that the destruction of the natural universe and the natural ecosystems are actually fatal, really, to the progress of the global economy. So it's people who can look at those issues and actually look for solutions, I think. And within corporates, the same qualities apply. So good leadership is actually inspiring others to take each part of the business model that they're working in. And this is something I've been really seeing at the Singapore Exchange, where Boon Chai Lo and Chairman Ko, they are actually asking everybody to think of themselves as really ESG leaders, and what part of the business that they're responsible for, how that can be made more carbon sensitive, and be able to measure that. And so I think it's people who have solutions as well as the outlook to make it happen.
Okay. Jane, can I just test that in a very friendly way?
Sure.
So we're talking about the Carneys, etc. of the world. These are, you refer to them as philosophers. They are leading.
Not just philosophers.
Not just philosophers, but they are thought leaders and
Yes.
and thinkers. Are they? Is that level of thought leadership really translating into practical change in the corporate environment, and in particularly in the corporate leadership environment, where so many executives and particularly CEOs and CFOs are under pressure on short-term quarterly financial performance, a host of other indicators that they have to step up to the mark to, that in many ways actually could fundamentally be dislocated from the sustainability of the planet's communities involved and environmental issues?
I don't think there's any doubt that everyone finds it a challenge to balance off the short-term returns and the longer-term returns. But interestingly, you mentioned Milton Friedman and the shareholder priority, really, and I think it's quite useful to see how all stakeholders' priority is now the shareholders' priority. In fact, it is the stakeholders who are influencing the shareholders to make ESG type decisions and to push the leadership of corporates to make ESG decisions. And, it's not merely a matter of regulation, it's also a matter of stimulation, and stimulation from the investing public, as well as the, if you like, the inner core of the company. And if that is actually what is rewarded, as you were going to touch on with remuneration, then I think that sort of energy will be a very positive force.
So if investors are demanding ESG, then one assumes that ESG makes good business practice and will ultimately translate into profits.
Exactly right.
Okay.
And the proof is there. If you look at many of the companies that are doing very well on stock exchanges, they are those which have embraced these concepts, because investors and asset managers are realizing that this is being demanded by investors.
Okay, Mark, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was listening to Jane very carefully, because one of the things that I've observed through my whole working life is a very positive disconnect between the day-to-day reality of running any organization and the narrative that you then step into when you deal with the world of shareholders and investors, particularly in listed companies. And it's always been a source of fascination to me that day to day, no one who leads a large organization at any level wakes up and thinks shareholder primacy. Maybe some of the bank folks do, but most people, they wake in the morning and they think, what about my customers? What about the people in the team that I'm working with? A long list of in reality stakeholder-based thinking. And so I think that the game that in a sense the financial markets have had us play to even pretend that good old Milton was right, it's just not even real. It's not even true in the operational reality. So what we're often doing is playing games in terms of, how do we talk about these things? And in that sense, I think where the opportunity lies and where the value is being created for everyone, by companies who are serious about this ESG agenda, is because if you look at what they're doing, I see one thing that everyone is doing, and that is shifting from putting the company in the middle of the room and figuring out how I maximize things for us, but shifting more to putting the issue in the middle of the room and asking, what is my role in changing that? So I don't know, just pick an example from my networks. I'd think of Paul Pullman at Unilever, and what Paul, I mean, when you talk to him in his post Unilever life, I mean, part of his passion to build initiatives around the world was the frustration with the limits of what you can do internally in any large organization that's sort of built in a particular logic. But he put the question in the middle of the room rather than the organization, which is, how do we make how does the world of the kind of things we do become relevant and appropriate for the world we'd like to build? And I think that's a really important difference.
Okay, thanks. Before I get on to you, Wendy, I just want to put a call out to our participants. As usual, we take questions. We look forward to your questions. Please do fire them through either on the chat or through other means. We will to open up to the questions and open up the discussion as a result, because this is very much a participatory and interchangeable discussion that we're having here with all of you all around the world. Wendy, I want to talk about materiality with you. Okay, I think it must be incredibly difficult for ESG leaders to actually know, for corporate leaders to actually know what are the critical ESG issues they need to be facing and addressing. So arguably in some parts of the world, perhaps it's not climate change as a top priority. There might be social issues that actually trump that. Do we, and it goes back to at a point made earlier around getting the issue in the boardroom for discussion, and focusing and making that front and center. How do leaders understand and determine the materiality across all these different ESG indicators that we have?
I think that's a great question. And as you can see from my logo I've got behind me, I'm involved also with an organization called ESG Africa Conference. And one of the reasons we started the conference was because we felt that African issues sometimes get forgotten in this discussion, where we're talking about big multinationals that can influence the world with some of their products and all of those things, which is wonderful and we absolutely need it. But along with that, we have these global value chains, many of which sit within Africa, where there's a lot of SMEs in that value chain, and who have very different constraints and priorities about what they think is important. So I think it's really critical to make sure that with materiality, we look at that broader context, make sure that we do have that balance, and also have that balance between long and short term. One of the reasons I really like TCFD is I'm a big scenario fan, and I love it that they force you to look into the future and say, we don't know what's going to happen. So how do we manage these issues and decide what's material when there's so much uncertainty? And human beings like choosing a path and making assumptions. So how do we get them out of that way of thinking? And one of the things we're doing at the ESG Africa conference this year also is to say, I stole this concept from the World Energy Council. What's keeping me awake at night? What are those things that are coming down the road at me? And what's keeping me busy during the day? And how do I get the balance between that? So I think the issue of materiality really has to be considered contextually very carefully. For Africa, the social issue oftentimes gets lost, and the economic realities of working with multiple small companies that don't have huge resources oftentimes gets lost as well. And so we really need to make sure that we look at our value chains. And again, it's going back to this sort of integrated, holistic picture, but then picking out those things that are really going to make a difference, and not focusing on things because GRI says you should. what are the ones that really are material to you, that are going to make the difference? And I think also acceptance that it's a journey and that you can't do everything all at once. And so smaller organizations can certainly grow into looking at how they integrate ESG more holistically into their processes. Thanks.
Fabulous insights about the fact that actually sustainability is a journey. We can't expect and anticipate overnight results and perfect reporting and perfect stakeholder engagements all around. We've had a couple of points coming in from folks in developing world markets. Wendy, would you be bold enough to perhaps indicate what you think might be the most material ESG issues that leaders have to face in non-developed world economies?
Well, I think certainly, as I said, the value chain and looking at supporting local communities. The bigger issues around what big companies can do to help with things like adaptation to climate change issues, certainly I think plays a big role, providing water or electricity or other things to local communities. Jobs and employment obviously is absolutely critical. And I think looking for those opportunities where we can do things in a transformative way that provides all of those things around, jobs and economic growth within developing countries, but at the same time reduces CO2 emissions. So that localization component and beneficiation, instead of us just exporting precious metals or whatever, the beneficiation of those locally. And I think if you look at some of the BRICS philosophies around making the market big enough in the South-South transfer as well, the South-South trade pictures, which are really starting to emerge a lot more strongly than they have in the past, which also then takes into consideration some of the developing country issues. But having said all of that, I mean, I think it's still critical to make sure that we're all moving in the same direction on global issues like climate change, but recognizing that it can be really, really difficult for some developing countries to move in that direction. And what can we do to make sure that we support, for example, global value chains to do things differently?
But you are advocating forgotten. You are advocating for some form of global collaboration, or at least global focus that we can all buy into. Jane, I know you've got some very specific thinking around the value of indigenous knowledge and the leadership in that you've come across there. I think that would be a fascinating aspect to this discussion. Can you just elaborate a bit more on that?
Well, I think that there's a lot that Indigenous people can offer in their wisdom and understanding of the way in which the natural ecosystems work. For generations, they managed to keep the natural ecosystems which help the earth remain harmonious. And we in the Industrial Revolution and the rest have managed to dislodge many of them. But that's very important, I think, that we take notice and listen to the contribution of Indigenous people. And we certainly are trying to do that here in New Zealand, and I applaud it thoroughly.
If you were a CEO or other executive member of a company in parts of the world where Indigenous people are actually are present, have an impact, it's integral to the economic development of the country, how would you go about incorporating them and integrating them into your wider business strategy?
Well, already we see here in New Zealand that Maori input is vital. For example, in our fishing industry, in many of our, we have many fishing companies in New Zealand which are owned by Maori tribes, and they are enormously effective both in export and in local selling of fish and the fishing industry. So we, and in for example, the setting up of principles for marine economy here in New Zealand, we are recommending that the Indigenous voice be very loudly heard, because they have a lot of wisdom about the entire natural landscape here in New Zealand. So I think it does depend on the business model of the company and whether it's material and relevant, but in many cases they will have views and wisdom that they know about, which are perhaps not as readily available to other people in the business. So
would you go as far as championing quota systems to incorporate certain percentages of Indigenous folks into supply chains, for example?
I think it depends on the business model, and it depends on the willingness and wishes of the Indigenous people themselves. I don't think one should be sort of trying to force those requirements, but I think nevertheless it's a silly company that may have something which the Indigenous community can contribute to, and if they don't, open themselves up to that.
Okay, thanks for that. Thanks, Mark. I'm going to send this question your way. It comes from someone called Paula Shatuna, which is, and the reason I'm sending it your way is your experience of both having worked in developing world markets at a corporate level and now in ostensibly a developed world market. The question is, how can developed countries assist the developing world in pursuing the sustainability narrative? Now, I want to bring this back to corporate leaders. This is not a national discussion. This is not a United Nations discussion. This is around leaders of developed world companies, probably multinational companies or smaller companies and supply chains. But how can what they are doing in those jurisdictions actually be translated into sustainability effectiveness in the developing world?
Thanks, Alex. It's a great question. In September last year, I stood up in front of 450 people in the Netherlands looking at the whole global food system. And the meeting was hosted by Nestle and Unilever. And the question in the room was, how do we make the food system more sustainable? And I stood up and said, well, the structural problem that you have as global players is that you've built your businesses essentially on an extractive supply chain model, where everything you do is designed to maximize your share of the value that's created in the journey between the field and the fork. And the weakest players in that system are the people who actually grow the food. And that is true of the smallholder. It was equally true of the small farmer in the developing world as it is in the developed world. And what I said was, your challenge is you want us to focus on, growing our food, the problem of the cost of production of more ecologically friendly food. Yet that's only 10 cents in the dollar of the total value that exists in the supply chain. So the real job is, how do we reconfigure the supply chain? And I think that in that insight lies a lot of the questions about the transformation in the global economy. And it's in my view, a very profound transformation from one in which essentially, as big organizations, you control the system to the best of your ability and extract the value out, to one where what you do is you enable a knowledge base that then creates much more circular local economic systems. And so I think the greatest contribution that many large organizations can make is to imagine their own demise, or at least the demise of their business models in the form that they currently have them, which are essentially often very extractive in their nature. And we spend a lot of time, wringing our hands about our carbon footprint while shipping things all over the world that could, in a reconfigured system, be made locally with knowledge that is transferred around the world. So I think the first thing to do is be really honest about your own contribution and role, and ask some really deep questions about what could it look like that is different to the system that we are both complicit in and really good at extracting value from. So you stand up in front of Nestle and ask them, how much of the price of a bar of chocolate ends up in the hands of the local grower in the country where the cacao was grown. And it's such an embarrassing number that they will avoid the question like hell. They'll spend lots of time telling you about all the great things they're doing, but in the final analysis, that bar of chocolate, you're lucky if 1 cent in the dollar ends up in the hands of the grower. And I think it's those structural things that we as big players around the world have to get honest about in order to make a real difference.
Okay, thank you. I want to talk, I mean, some questions are coming in around how you build sustainability leadership within an executive body, right? So the actual structures, what is required other than just maybe fortuitously having a ESG champion in the among the different directors on a executive committee. Wendy, do we need to be moving in this direction of having chief sustainability officers? What are their roles? If they're going to be effective, it's cross-cutting, but they have to get the buy-in from all other business areas, and the directors responsible for that. Have you got viewpoints on how we actually build it in beyond just being a lone voice on a committee or on a board?
I think, as I said earlier, that really sustainability leadership has to come from across the whole organization. There's very few points in a company where it's like a coalescence of issues. Sustainability is one of them, and so strategy and risk. So one of the things I think that we can do is look at the structures of the organization and don't set them up as silos. So at one stage, I worked in an organization where strategy, risk, planning, and sustainability was all in one department. And for me, that made a lot of sense, so that you integrate things rather than keep them separate. I think you've also got to devolve the conversation down to the pain points of the organization that need addressing, so that if you can't go and talk about, long-term futuristic things to operational guys, make sure that you understand their specific sustainability issues and get them to take ownership of it, because it's like with safety. You can't have a safety department sitting at head office that's responsible for safety on site. It's got to be the guy that's actually walking the plant with the hard hat on that actually takes accountability for that. So it's making sure that we understand that ESG conversation at all the different levels in the organization. And I think the last point for me around sustainability leadership is that of diversity and inclusion. So for me, diversity is so important in getting different voices, so that you don't just get one voice in Exco or whatever committee's taking decisions around a specific issue. But then also inclusion, which is then listening to those voices and taking them into consideration. And that's a leadership trait which I think we don't encourage enough in our leaders, is to say, make sure that you speak to a variety of people, and not only in the organization, but outside, but also listen and incorporate what they say into your thinking and demonstrate it by your actions, which are seen by everybody. If you have a diverse board and then you don't listen to half the people, it sends a different message. So how do we make sure that we get that? Because things are changing rapidly and changing all the time. So if you don't have that conversation going on all the time, you're not going to be able to keep pace with it. And that's a very different leadership skill to what we used to. And, Peter Drucker's got that famous comment, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And if we don't have that culture of sustainability, that it's important to the organization, that it adds value to the organization, and we all practice it in our own way, then your strategy is not gonna happen either. So it's all about the people.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Mark, here's a question for you. Are business schools adequately training and preparing future corporate leaders for issues on ESG and sustainability?
No, of course not. If they were, we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation. And I think there's two levels of, and I say this with the humility of having sort of been heavily involved in trying to figure out what business schools need to look like and be different, in what way, but also recognizing that it's a very difficult task. And the first thing I would say is that I profoundly believe that business is not something that is best learned in the classroom. It is fundamentally a craft that you learn by doing it under the tutelage of people who are cleverer at it than you are, and in a reflective process. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that you have this contradiction in the silo logic of the way we have built all academic disciplines, in that you will go and spend an hour talking about, I don't know, green issues with a particular lecturer and how you can market and create products that are more ecologically friendly. And then you'll walk into the next room and spend an hour with the tax expert telling you how to be tax efficient, which is code for avoid paying taxes around the world as much as you can. And these disconnects don't get joined up, and they don't get joined up because there isn't a holistic, to take the word Wendy was using earlier, a holistic insight that informs what you're trying to do overall. And if I may, I'll just give you one example of where that's led us to in our nascent organization. And that is, we've shifted away from a triple bottom line, and we now work with 5 levels of insight that start every board meeting. And the first one is, and they're not in level of importance, but they reflect our effort to find different ways of thinking about these things. And we think that's the core problem. It's thinking about it in a different way. So we look at profit and prosperity as one level. We look at social cohesion. Now, social cohesion is really interesting. How are we doing in terms of our relationships with each other and our relationships with other people? We look at our place in the world. Are we making a difference and a contribution in the context beyond our boundaries? Then we go into a really interesting one, which is, are we realizing the potential of all our stakeholders? Now, that's a really interesting thought. So it's not good enough to say we're not doing any damage, but what is the potential of all our stakeholders, and are we helping them realize that? And nature will be in there as well. And then the fifth one was really challenging, is we think about the degree to which we're resolving the big disintegration that's happened in the last 300 years since the Industrial Revolution, of us and nature being seen as separate things. So we talk about that as resolving duality. Now, this sounds like super intellectual mumbo jumbo when you first hear it, but day to day, by starting our board meetings with that analysis, it completely changes the conversations we have afterwards. And so for me, it's very much about trying to think of different ways to approach things. And I think that's the weakness in business education, is it simply doesn't do that. It just talks about systems in the way they exist today.
Fascinating. Some applause coming in from the audience on those perspectives. I want to tackle the thorny issue here of ESG linked remuneration at an executive level. Jane, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, let's put this into perspective. So many of the new sustainability reporting frameworks are asking questions about it. It's part and parcel of the CDP. It's part and parcel of the TCFD. In fact, the CDP goes so far as to positively score it in a competitive scoring landscape. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? So let's talk about the motivation around ESG performance. What is ESG performance in the first place? And does remuneration linked to that performance actually drive the desired results that we're looking for?
Well, I think it's really quite a complex question, because it does depend where you sit in the organisation, and it depends too on the business model of the organisation. So to have a generalised yes or no on the remuneration question, I think is quite tricky. But it seems to me that the whole concept of embedding ESG or infusing ESG into the entire culture of the organisation is the vitally important part. And so everybody must have some role that requires them to be contributing to either your carbon measurement, your carbon management, your data collection in relation to that, to enable you to know what your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 carbon greenhouse gas emissions are, in order to be able to manage them and reduce them and sequester carbon if possible, etc. So I think the the question of remuneration should be linked to the role in which the individual has to enable the company to perform better in relation to its ESG requirements and challenges. And so I think it's not something that one can say, well, I think the initial response would be yes, of course, we should be rewarding people who are doing good ESG. But where you are in the company and how the role you play will determine, one, are you at the strategic level where you're actually setting the course for the business model and setting that, but then of course, if you're doing something which, let's say you're being measured by the World Benchmarking Alliance against the SDGs, which would give you a great indicator of your social indicators. They work with the core social indicators. They work with the human rights due diligence. You would be able to look into your company and say, yes, we understand this. And the second thing that I think we haven't yet really touched on is the data revolution. And the fact that that is transforming the way in which companies are able to measure, report, manage, and the companies like Persephone, for example, which is a carbon management company, a tech company, are revolutionizing and making so much easier the way in which companies can do not only their scope 1 and scope 2, which are you draw from within your company, but scope 3, which is often very difficult. And just as Wendy was saying, the supply chains can be very long. And in those companies or entities will be the carbon that comes into the product or process that you are engaged in. And you have to measure them all in order to be captured under TCFD. And of course, the nature TNFD will have similar issues about the natural world. So I think, without the data piece in this debate or discussion, I think we're not actually focusing, because that is another one of the tools, the enablers, for people to show that in their role that they are actually managing the carbon or the other social indicators. And I think we've just got to get our heads around that as a vital part. So what I see is the data revolution intersecting with the carbon revolution is really part of the solution to this. And it'll be an enabler for people in corporates to be able to actually identify, manage, and show that they're actually managing these things.
Data absolutely critical. I would imagine you'd go on to say interpretation thereof or thereafter is really the key skill and of an ESG leader, taking it to another level. Yeah.
And to be educated and understand how the use of data is vital in this coming age. Absolutely. Okay.
Just to let you know, a lot of applause coming in for those thoughts as well. So thank you. Wendy, it's in your work trying to drive efficacy and efficiencies within an organization. Tell me your perspective on ESG linked remuneration for top leadership in an organization.
Well, I've been in a couple of organizations where it's been tried. And really, if you do ESG correctly, it should be embedded in your performance indicators anyway, it's for the company. I think one of the things that we oftentimes shy away from is measuring behavior as well as performance on actual data. And I think from a leadership perspective, that is really important. And it's sometimes tricky to measure. But as I was saying earlier, for inclusion, for example, the way in which somebody responds to a variety of different views around the table and listens to them or incorporates them is something that's important from a risk perspective and also from an opportunity perspective. So having things like 360-degree assessments of leadership behaviors, asking stakeholders what they think, it makes you quite vulnerable as a leader to go into those kinds of things. But if you really want to have a co-creative, inclusive type of leadership style, you have to look at behavior as well as data.
Great points. So it goes back to the cultural aspect being driven throughout an organization, which also really talks about the human energy within that company. Absolutely critical, and that gets driven by leadership, right? At the end of the day, a dynamic leader, it infuses that energy throughout the organization. So I find that an absolutely critical link to take place there as well. We've had a couple of questions come in around ESG leadership or sustainability leadership at government level and within government organizations. Now, we talk endlessly about the private sector. We mustn't forget the public sector. The public sector plays a critical role, not just in developing economies, but facilitating the interchange between different players within economies. So I would like to, is there anyone out of the three of you that would like to take a stab at how one instills such leadership within public enterprises, government organizations?
I actually think that in some places, government organizations are taking a leadership role. If you look at some of the policies that are really encouraging green activities and particularly environmentally positive activities, you'll see, for example, here in New Zealand, that there are certain cashbacks if you buy an electric car. There are disincentives to continue to drive diesel vehicles. Now that's a government policy, and government organisations are actually modelling that and also are encouraging and enforcing it. So I think that a lot of public sector are already, frankly, looking at climate change and taking it seriously within their organisations and developing policy that is actually then congruent with ESG. So I don't think they're left out. I think they're actually, and certainly I understand that the public sector standard setters are also very cognizant of this and working hard on ESG issues.
Wendy, you got your hand up there.
I completely agree with Jane. I think if government really wants, government is supposed to interfere where there is a market failure, right? If you look at the externality theory. And if government wants to shift in a certain direction, absolutely, we need that policy. I think oftentimes what's happening is that businesses is getting ahead of government and wanting government to put policy in place. So we've really got to make sure that government has adequate policy that is long-term enough and that gives enough investor certainty for people to be able to move in the short term, but also protects and makes sure that that balance that we were talking about earlier, that the social issues are not forgotten about either, because that's one of their big roles.
Mark, your viewpoints? Yeah, I was interesting. It was a tough question, and I noticed we all paused before we dived in. I think one of the things that's happened in the last 50 years is the degree to which a lot of policy has been essentially, I'd say, co-opted by existing business. And I think one of the hardest things is that when there's a conversation about these kind of issues, what's clearly in the room is the vested interest of large organizations with the limited ability they've got to adapt to the best of their ability. But what's not in the room is all the enterprise that could be created in a different reality. And so I think one of the things that the critical role of the public sector, particularly the political space, is to be much bolder in leadership and to link much more firmly to the deep questions that really do affect us all, and be braver when dealing with the voices of, if you like, the established enterprise, which will always tell you why it's a problem to change the rules, but equally is always really good when you do change the rules and it's clear what the new rules are, to then get on and figure out how to do well within that new context. So I think there's a very, very important role, which is paradoxically to listen less to the voice of successful business today and think deeper about the big issues and create policy context in which then we all reorientate ourselves to produce the clean energy future that we need, or the circular economies that we need, or the more socially just employment systems that we need, or any one of the other 20 issues that really matter and are important.
Yeah, seems to be a conundrum between what comes first, policy or leadership within organizations. I sense they're both drivers actually for sustainability and should work in tandem. I would like to before we start rounding off this discussion, the personality of a executive ESG leader is probably quite unique if we're honest about it. It's not that Mark's already alluded to the fact that it's not taught in business schools. You're certainly not going to get it studying a CA. You might get a bit of it studying an MBA. You might get a bit of it in organizational psychology, but these are all skill sets that people are trained with to go into leadership positions. So inevitably, we're talking about personality traits, individual personality traits of the great ESG leaders. Bearing in mind that not everyone will have those traits, I'd just like to get reflection from all three of you around the obstacles that executive leaders face in terms of actually being able to adopt good ESG practice. And in the face of those obstacles, are there frameworks, tools, etc., that they could be relying on or deploying to actually help them move with this rapidly changing landscape that you mentioned right at the beginning, Wendy? So let me start with you on that.
Thank you. I think one of the biggest obstacles is getting everyone to go along with you if you're a leader. And I think certainly, which is what I was mentioning earlier with the scenarios with TCFD, I think certainly leaders today have to take the time out of ExCo and board discussions to really spend quality time thinking about the future. People, because we have these burning platforms of issues happening at the moment, people tend to focus on those. So it's really is taking the time to look about the longer term and making sure that you then act accordingly and timeously to some of those issues that are coming out. And I think the other big barrier is the self-awareness of the leader, making sure that they understand their own risk appetite and the risk appetite of the people that they're dealing with, and be able to influence them, to be able to open their minds using different types of tools like scenarios, but also systems thinking. Some of the work that's been done by Carneffen on sense making, exposing people to different ways of thinking and making the time in their diaries and board meetings to do it. I loved Mark's analysis of those 5 points, because some of those really will make you think like that and put you in an innovative space before you even start considering the issues of the day. Thank you.
Mark, can we get the kind of systemic change within corporate leadership that is required? What are your thoughts?
I think we can. I think it's very difficult. And what I observe over the years is many people who are the most radical innovators end up going out and doing their own thing, because it's actually easier to build something new than it is to re-engineer the plane while you're flying it. I'm glad Wendy mentioned the word sense making, and in the Globally Responsible Leadership Initiative, we always talked about the two fundamental roles that leaders have. And the first one is sense making, really understanding the world in which you're living and what needs to be done, what really matters. And the second part is sense giving, which is figuring out how to translate that into a conversation with your colleagues, whether it's your peers or your subordinates or the people you report to, that enables them to hear the conversation, to hear the issue that needs to be addressed in a way that they can practically address it. Now that sounds very theoretical, but it's not. So for example, in my life, one of the ways I did that, trying to drive sustainability in an organization, was taking the top 400 people in an organization of 30,000 and constantly engaging them with new ideas and new insights and new perspectives, and saying, and this is why it matters for us. and just changing the culture by changing the nature of the conversation and focusing on the things that perhaps are not in the daily awareness against their targets for this week, but really matters. So sense making and sense giving is the two critical roles that a leader must play.
Thank you very much. I'm going to steal a minute here just to get perspective from Jane. Jane, your thoughts on obstacles and how leaders can actually get their voices heard in organizations?
Well, Alex, I actually think over the last decade, there's been an absolute transformation in the way leaders look at ESG. And in particular, they look at carbon and the risks of climate change. And we're seeing evidence of climate change already around the world. The reality is here. And I think even 5 to 8 years ago, some leaders would have said, I just want to go on with the old business model. Today, no credible, I don't think, credible corporate leader can say that. They are not credible to their shareholders or to their wider stakeholders, and particularly those wider stakeholders who are actually important in actually making their business go. So I'm a little more optimistic, I think, than that. I don't think we need new solutions in that respect. And of course, the externalities of the regulatory frameworks that are being developed, the disclosure requirements, all of those things are, I think, an encouragement, frankly, to the leaders to go with this new paradigm and to learn about it, use technology to understand it. And I think I'm really optimistic that we're seeing this transformation happening, and I'm really very engaged and thoroughly enjoying it.
Thank you for that. I do like to leave a discussion on a positive note, so I'm going to take my opportunity here to do that. I need to thank the three of you panelists tremendously for your time, but more importantly, your insights and your thoughts and your willingness to engage openly and transparently. It has been a fascinating conversation. I would also like to thank the participants and attendees, and you know, I'm really sorry, we're really sorry that we couldn't get to each and every question that came through, because they were fascinating in themselves. We will endeavor to capture those questions and perhaps send them to the participants to get some feedback. It has been a rich discussion. It's been a wonderful discussion. I think it's such an important discussion. So I thank all of you tremendously, and I thank the ESG Africa conference for supporting us and putting this together. And I look forward to the next webinar. So thank you all. And I wish you all a great day forward. And Carolyn, I'm sure you want to come in.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex. Thank you for hosting this event. Next Tuesday, next month's first Tuesdays are coming up. Please stay on the emailing list so we can tell you all about it. Thank you so much, Jane, for staying up so late for us, and Mark for coming online, and Wendy, thank you so much. We were at the ESG Africa conference last year as the ESG Exchange. It was fantastic. It was also online, so please have a look at I put the registration details on the chat. You can also get them from the event page. Please go and sign up and join ESG Africa conference in October this year. Thanks everyone, and be safe.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Very much. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone.